July 4, 1944. Fireworks erupted over small-town America. Children in Ohio and Kansas craned their necks to watch streaks of light burst against the summer night, mothers fanned themselves on porches, and fathers grilled meat that few Europeans had seen in years. Independence Day carried its usual symbolism, yet beneath the celebration was a quieter reality. In camps scattered across the United States, thousands of captured Germans were already behind barbed wire. Some of them were women, drawn from the auxiliary services of Hitler's regime, now stripped of rank and uniform, bewildered by a captivity that looked nothing like the horrors they had been taught to expect. For these women, the journey to America had been long and humiliating. They had marched through ruins in Normandy, herded by soldiers they once considered weak. They had boarded ships under the jeers of French civilians, carrying little more than fear and exhaustion. Their minds replayed the steady drumbeat of German propaganda. America was a land of brutality, a capitalist wasteland where prisoners would be beaten, starved, and forgotten. Every rumor insisted that surrender meant degradation. And so when the coastline of New York or Virginia finally came into view, many felt their stomachs twist with dread. But what awaited them was not torture. It was order. Registration papers, photographs, medical exams, and finally transport inland to a latticework of camps that stretched from Texas to Wisconsin. The U.S. military had built hundreds of these compounds, designed less like medieval prisons and more like tidy villages, each with its own fences, barracks, kitchens, and workshop. There were rules, of course, and armed guards who never looked away, but there was also something else: predictability. 3 meals a day. Clean bedding. Soap. For those who had watched cities like Hamburg collapse under Allied bombing, such regularity felt unreal. Numbers reveal the scale. Between 1942 and 1946, over 370,000 German prisoners were shipped to America. While the vast majority were men, thousands of women captured in supporting roles, secretaries, nurses, and clerks, were also sent across the Atlantic. They were dispersed into camps such as Fort Devens in Massachusetts and Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, where the routines of captivity blurred strangely with glimpses of normal civilian life. American townspeople could sometimes see them through the wire, hanging laundry or walking in formation. For the prisoners, it was like living inside a mirror, so close to freedom, yet locked within its reflection. At first, suspicion hardened them. The women whispered that the food must be poisoned, that the guards' politeness was some kind of trick, that this apparent generosity hid a cruelty waiting to spring. One recalled, in a later memoir, how she refused her first slice of white bread because it seemed impossible that anyone would waste such soft flour on a prisoner. Another wrote of listening in disbelief when guards described baseball, a game that seemed both nonsensical and lavish compared to the hunger that defined her memories of Europe. Still, hunger broke suspicion. By the third day, most were eating everything given. The meals were not gourmet. Army cooks worked with bulk rations, but they were steady, and that steadiness was what shocked them. Eggs in the morning, potatoes, meat, vegetables, sometimes even dessert. It contrasted painfully with what their families endured at home, where ration books governed every crumb, where margarine masqueraded as butter, and where coffee had long ago been replaced with bitter substitute. In Germany, sugar was precious enough to vanish from daily life. In America, it was stirred casually into cups of steaming coffee offered even to captives. The emotional conflict grew sharper with each passing week. Many of these women had carried deep conviction in the superiority of their homeland, the righteousness of their cause. Yet here they were, eating more in captivity than their children ate in freedom. Each bite was a reminder that the world they had been taught to despise might, in fact, be living better than the Reich they had pledged to serve. The contradiction gnawed at them more than the barbed wire did. And yet, the camps were not paradise. Isolation weighed heavily. Letters trickled in months late, censored and blackened by ink. Rumors of devastation in their hometowns spread like fever. Air raids on Berlin, the collapse of supply lines, the disappearance of fathers and brothers to the Eastern Front, all these fears hung over them. The camp became a liminal space, safe from bombs but haunted by silence. In their bunks, women wept for children they might never see again. The irony was bitter. Survival in America while families suffered in Germany. For the U.S. government, the strategy was deliberate. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, but America went further, reasoning that well-fed prisoners might be more cooperative. Farm labor was scarce with so many young Americans overseas, so POWs were sometimes contracted out to harvest crops or cut timber. In return, they earned small wages redeemable at camp canteens. Cigarettes, soap, even Coca-Cola. These tokens of normal life passed through their hand. For some, it was exhilarating, for others, humiliating. To buy a chocolate bar as a prisoner while one's mother starved under rationing back home seemed an unbearable moral rift. Not all guards sympathized. There were men who spat insults, who called the women Hitler girls with a sneer. But even the insults carried less weight than expected, for cruelty was never systematized. Discipline existed, but brutality was rare, and over time, prisoners learned to relax into the rhythms of confinement. Skepticism softened into cautious observation. They noticed how American soldiers joked with each other, how they shared cigarettes freely, how their discipline lacked the rigid fear that had defined German barracks. Slowly, they realized the war had carried them into a world that operated on entirely different assumptions. The greatest contrast was not the fences, nor the watchtowers, but the food. Every mealtime was a collision of expectation and reality. Women whispered about it in their bunks, wrote about it in secret diaries, compared it to the meager scraps they remembered from home. Each plate seemed like a rebuke to the propaganda they had believed. And still, none of them knew that the most unforgettable moment was yet to come, a moment that would not involve guns, or punishments, or interrogations, but something so ordinary, so sweet, it would draw tears from eyes hardened by war. It began with the rumor of dessert. The rumor began in whispers, passed from bunk to bunk like contraband. Someone said the Americans were serving a special dessert. Another swore she had seen the cooks carrying large tubs packed with ice and something darker than milk. The women dismissed it at first. Prisoners were given many things, but not luxuries. Still, curiosity clung to them like the humid summer air. When the dinner bell rang and the mess hall filled, the truth revealed itself with the clatter of trays and the unmistakable sight of scoops plunging into metal containers. Ice cream. For most of these German women, it was an unknown word. They had eaten ices as children at fairs before the war, flavored snow with syrup or lemon, but never anything like this, dairy whipped, churned, frozen into smooth perfection. And chocolate? That had vanished from German markets years earlier, swallowed by rationing and war. To imagine both together was like imagining victory after defeat. Inconceivable. The line moved slowly, every step carrying disbelief. The air was heavy with the scent of cooked meat and potatoes, yet it was the faint aroma of cocoa that captured attention. A guard, barely older than the prisoners, stood with a scoop in hand, motioning each woman forward. He worked methodically, dropping neat mounds into tin bowls. The ice cream glistened in the light, a dark sheen softening at the edges. Some prisoners reached the counter only to hesitate, unsure if it was truly meant for them. One woman, a former nurse from Bremen, later wrote that her hands trembled as she accepted the bowl. She could not remember the last time she had held anything so cold. She carried it to her seat as though it might vanish if she blinked. Around her, murmurs rose in a dozen dialects, laughter, disbelief, prayers whispered under breath. A few stared at the dessert without touching it, as if to eat it would break some spell. The first taste was silence. The metal spoons scraped softly, and then came the pause. Eyes widened. Lips parted in wonder. The cold shocked teeth and tongue. The chocolate melted into bitterness and sweetness at once, and for many it was too much. A young secretary from Hamburg lowered her spoon and pressed her face into her hands, tears sliding between her fingers. Another laughed out loud, the sound bubbling up uncontrollably, startling even herself. A third woman, once a devoted member of the Bund Deutscher Madel, muttered that nothing in Hitler's Germany had ever tasted like this. The guards watched from the corners of the hall. Some grinned, some shook their heads. For them, ice cream was ordinary, the stuff of hot afternoons and childhood summers. They could not fully grasp what it meant to those across the room. One soldier, scribbling a letter home, noted how the Kraut girls nearly cried over dessert. Makes you wonder what kind of life they lived back there. He could not have known how accurate he was. Because in Germany, by 1944, hunger was a constant companion. Civilians survived on ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley, on watery soups bulked with turnips, on bread stretched with sawdust and ground peas. The average calorie intake in cities had dropped dangerously low. Children's growth slowed. Malnutrition crept into every household. The idea of milk being churned into something as frivolous as ice cream was unimaginable. And here, in captivity, the enemy served it casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The psychological effect cut deep. To eat well in defeat while families starved in freedom was a paradox too heavy to ignore. Some women confessed later that the guilt of that sweetness was unbearable. Yet in that moment, with chocolate melting across their tongues, the guilt yielded to something else: astonishment. It was not just food. It was proof. Proof that the world they had been taught to hate might in fact be richer, stranger, and kinder than they could have imagined. The nurse from Bremen described it as tasting a future that could not exist in Germany. She had treated children with hollow cheeks, mothers with sunken eyes, soldiers wasting away from wounds and poor rations. She thought she had forgotten the flavor of hope. And then a spoonful of ice cream reminded her it could be sweet. Even humor found its way into the mess hall. One woman, frustrated by her spoon clinking against the tin, quipped that perhaps the Americans were trying to break their teeth. Another teased that if Hitler had promised chocolate ice cream for all, maybe she would have believed him longer. Laughter rolled unevenly, but it rolled, and for a few minutes, the camp seemed less like a prison. Yet under the laughter lay a fracture. The ice cream was not merely indulgence. It was a revelation of disparity. Why could America afford such luxuries while Germany collapsed? How could the enemy provide more for captives than the Reich provided for its citizens? These questions lodged deep, harder to swallow than the dessert itself. For women who had lived inside the echo chamber of propaganda, the sweetness became a bitter contradiction. Not everyone accepted it. A few pushed their bowls aside, refusing to eat. They muttered about tricks, about poison, about shame. Their pride could not bear the gift. But they were the minority. Most ate. Some scraped the bowls clean, chasing every melting drop. And afterward, many sat in stunned quiet, unable to speak, their emotions too tangled to articulate. Years later, testimonies would surface in letters and memoirs. A former prisoner recalled, "I cried not because of the taste, but because I realized my children at home would never know such a thing." Another wrote, "I had thought the Americans were monsters. Monsters do not feed you ice cream." These recollections, preserved in archives and oral histories, confirm the moment's strange power. In the camp's rhythm, the ice cream day might have seemed a small anomaly. But to the women it was seismic. It shifted the ground of belief, eroded certainty, carved a gap between what they had been taught and what they now lived. The war still raged, bombs still fell, families still starved, but inside the wire, a spoonful of chocolate ice cream had planted doubt, and with it, a glimmer of longing for a world beyond barbed fences. That night, as the heat faded and the lights dimmed, women lay in their bunks replaying the taste. Some smiled in the dark. Others wept quietly. A few stared at the ceiling, shaken not by captivity, but by kindness. They had prepared for cruelty, for hunger, for despair. They had not prepared for sweetness. And none of them knew that this was only the first of many shocks America would deliver. Morning in the camp arrived with the sound of boots on gravel and the clatter of the breakfast bell. By then, The memory of chocolate ice cream had softened into a story retold in bunks and work details, almost like a dream shared by all. Yet daily life resumed, and it was the rhythms of captivity that revealed the strangest truths. 3 meals were served with military precision: eggs, oatmeal, bread, sometimes sausages or bacon, and each plate reminded the women of what their families lacked back home. In Germany, rations had fallen below survival levels. In America, prisoners consumed more calories than many free civilians in Europe. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For the women who had once paraded in smart uniforms, proud auxiliaries of the Reich, the new uniform was plain: drab dresses, worn shoes, hair tied back under kerchief. The guards did not humiliate them, but the sameness stripped away rank and pride. Still, what struck them most was not the loss of insignia but the gain of freedom within captivity. They were expected to work, cleaning, cooking, repairing clothing, but their labor ended with hours of leisure. Libraries stocked with English novels, sewing circles, language classes, even orchestras filled the days. Some joined choirs, their voices rising above the barbed wire, startling townsfolk who paused outside the camp to listen. The irony was cruel. Inside the wire, women found books and music. Outside, back in Europe, those same freedoms were being silenced under bombs and fire. The contrast carved into their hearts. One prisoner later recalled how reading an American magazine about Hollywood glamour felt like gazing through a window into another planet, one where skirts flared with excess fabric, while she remembered cutting up curtains for her daughter's dresses. Work details outside the camp heightened the paradox further. America's manpower shortage was acute. With so many young men overseas, farms needed hands. Prisoners were marched to fields where they picked cotton, gathered fruit, and hoed rows of vegetables. For their labor, they were paid a token wage, coupons redeemable at camp canteens. The first time a German woman used her earnings to purchase a Coca-Cola, she laughed aloud at the absurdity. A sworn enemy of the United States sipping its most famous symbol beneath a striped awning. She described the fizz against her tongue, the sweetness biting like champagne, and wondered what her comrades back home would think if they saw her. These privileges did not erase homesickness. Every letter received carried more weight than any luxury. When censors finally delivered mail, the women devoured every line, tracing the handwriting of mothers, husbands, and sisters. Often, the words were bleak. Bombs had destroyed streets, food was scarce, neighbors were gone. Some letters carried no joy, only silence, whole pages blacked out by military censors. To read such words while sitting on a wooden bench, full from lunch, was to feel guilt heavy as iron. Not all prisoners surrendered to the strange kindness. Some clung fiercely to loyalty, refusing to speak English, scorning American generosity as decadent waste. They ate the meals, yes, but their eyes hardened. They insisted this was a facade, that true cruelty would come later. Others wrestled in secret with changing minds. A young secretary from Cologne wrote in her diary that she had expected whips and starvation. Instead, she found guards who tipped their caps politely. "I do not know what to believe anymore," she confessed. That uncertainty was its own form of punishment. Moments of humor broke through the tension. The Americans loved baseball, and prisoners were invited to watch, even to play. The women laughed at the sight of their comrades flailing wildly at pitches, swinging bats like awkward sighs. To them, the game seemed silly, a contest of standing still and then suddenly running. Yet the guards played with boyish enthusiasm, shouting and cheering. The Germans teased that it was a game for children, though secretly they admired the joy it inspired. When one woman finally connected bat to ball and sent it arcing into the outfield, both teams erupted with cheers. For a brief instant, the wire seemed invisible. Statistics tell part of the story. By 1945, the U.S. government spent nearly $1 per day feeding each prisoner, a sum that astonished even American taxpayers. The rations exceeded Geneva Convention requirements, and the menu often mirrored that of U.S. soldiers. This generosity sparked occasional protests from local civilians who wondered why the enemy ate better than they did. Newspapers ran editorials, some angry, some proud. But for the prisoners, the meaning was not in numbers. It was in the quiet astonishment of butter on bread, sugar in coffee, and milk poured without ration cards. The emotional conflict deepened with each season. Winter brought blankets and heated barracks, while in Germany people froze in basements. Spring brought Easter eggs dyed in bright colors, given by Red Cross volunteers, while in Hamburg, children searched rubble for crumbs. These contrasts etched themselves into memory. Prisoners began to realize that their image of America as a land of greed and cruelty was unsustainable. The reality before their eyes was undeniable. Here, the enemy practiced abundance. Yet abundance alone did not heal the wound of defeat. Some women found themselves ashamed of how easily they enjoyed American comfort. They feared that each bite of meat, each sip of soda, was betrayal of the homeland. In the dark, they whispered that perhaps they had been deceived their whole lives. The questions were dangerous but inescapable. If the enemy gave ice cream and books, then what had their own leaders given them, except fear and ruin? In these quiet contradictions lay the real transformation. Captivity became less about fences and more about ideas unraveling. The ice cream had been the first shock, but it was daily life that kept unraveling the threads of certainty. Women who had once marched in rallies with arms raised now bent over sewing machines, humming American tunes. They looked at guards not as monsters but as men who missed their families too. They realized that war had placed them on opposite sides of a line that seemed less clear with each passing day. Still, there were moments when the illusion of gentleness broke. A fight in the yard, a shouted insult, a guard's rifle glinting in the sun, reminders that freedom was an arm's length away, yet unreachable. And always the letters kept coming, each one heavier than the last. One woman clutched a page reporting her brother killed at the front. She had eaten a slice of apple pie only hours earlier. The sweetness turned to ash in her mouth. By the time summer returned, the memory of chocolate ice cream was no longer singular. It had become symbolic, shorthand among the women for the bewildering kindness of their captors. They spoke of it with a mix of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude for the gift, resentment for the way it exposed the hollowness of what they had once believed. And then, as rumors spread of Germany's collapse, of Hitler's fate, of cities leveled beyond recognition, a new question rose quietly in their minds. If this was captivity, what would freedom look like? By the spring of 1945, the war that had carried them across the Atlantic was collapsing. The women in the camps followed news trickling through guards' conversations, Red Cross bulletins, and censored letters. Rumors whispered of Hitler's bunker, of Berlin burning, of Germany breaking into pieces. For some, the knowledge brought despair, for others an unexpected relief. The Reich that had once seemed eternal was vanishing, and with it, the certainty that had bound them. In the camp, change was measured not only by news but by hearts softening. The same women who had once clenched fists at the thought of defeat now found themselves lingering at the fences, watching guards play baseball, humming American songs learned in English classes, or sharing cigarettes with fellow prisoners under a warm sky. Their resistance ebbed slowly, worn down not by cruelty but by daily kindness. The ice cream had been the first fracture, but the widening crack was made by every meal, every smile, every unexpected gesture of decency. Personal transformations unfolded in small, quiet ways. One nurse who had treated wounded soldiers for years confessed to her bunkmate that she no longer dreamed of victory. She dreamed instead of food, of safety, of children growing without fear. Another, who once wrote glowing letters to Nazi youth groups, began sketching portraits of guards, capturing their humanity with strokes of pencil she would never have dared back home. A secretary kept a secret journal, recording the contradictions of her heart. I have lost my homeland, yet here I eat like a guest. I do not know if I should thank or despise them. The irony was sharp. These women had been prepared to endure pain, but not generosity. They had been told the Americans were savage, yet the savagery never came. Instead came books, music, baseball, even ice cream. This inversion was more difficult to endure than whips or hunger might have been, because it demanded reflection. It forced them to see the possibility that their nation's story had been false. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, the camp atmosphere shifted again. Some prisoners celebrated privately, not out of joy but exhaustion. Others wept, clinging to each other in fear of the unknown. What would become of them? Would they ever see their families? Would they return to rubble, to judgment, to homes that no longer stood? The barbed wire had once defined their captivity, but now it seemed like protection, holding them in a strange pocket of abundance while the world outside smoldered. Over the next months, the routines deepened their paradoxical affection for America. Guards grew familiar, names were exchanged, jokes shared. Red Cross packages delivered more treats. Gum, chocolate, sometimes magazines. Prisoners laughed at American advertisements, baffled by the extravagance of shiny cars and new dresses. Yet beneath the laughter was envy, even longing. For some, the first taste of Coca-Cola or the memory of chocolate ice cream became symbols of a life they wanted but knew they could not have. Testimonies recorded years later reveal the depth of this transformation. One woman admitted that the ice cream had undone her loyalty more than any interrogation ever could. Another recalled how she realized her children had grown up with bombs while American children grew up with candy bars. These revelations did not erase grief or anger, but they cracked open a new perspective. Perhaps the enemy was not the monster she had believed, perhaps the world was larger than the narrow cage of ideology she had inherited. Yet guilt lingered. How could they relish sweetness while their families starved? How could they laugh at baseball while their brothers died? This contradiction haunted them, and many carried it for life. Some returned to Germany ashamed of the comfort they had known. Others quietly shared the stories, describing the shocking generosity of American camp. These tales became part of the mosaic of post-war memory, shaping how ordinary Germans viewed the United States in the years of occupation and rebuilding. When repatriation finally came in 1946, departure was bittersweet. The women packed what little they had, letters, sketches, memories, and boarded ships bound for a homeland scarred by loss. They looked back at the barracks, the watchtowers, the fences, and felt a strange ache. They were leaving captivity, yet in some ways they were leaving safety. Ahead lay ruins and rationing, hunger and political uncertainty. Behind them lay steady meals, warm beds, and the haunting kindness of an enemy. 4 years afterward, the memory of that ice cream lingered like a ghost. Some women told their children, others never spoke of it. But in archives and oral histories, fragments survive. The trembling hand holding a spoon, the laughter through tears, the whispered realization that propaganda had lied. These memories stand as testimony to the quiet power of small mercies. They reveal how something as simple as dessert could pierce through walls of ideology, softening hearts more effectively than threats ever could. Historians note that not all experiences were equal, not every camp was kind, not every guard gentle. Yet the pattern remains. American policy leaned toward humanity, and that humanity left an imprint. It was not ice cream alone that transformed prisoners, but the steady accumulation of gestures, fair treatment, adequate food, respect for dignity, that challenged the very foundations of their beliefs. The story of German women weeping over chocolate ice cream is more than anecdote, it is emblematic of a larger truth. That compassion, even in war, has the power to disarm. As the years rolled on, many of those women grew old, carrying the memory into quieter lives. Some emigrated, some rebuilt in Germany, some spoke of America with awe, others with conflicted bitterness. But none forgot that day in the mess hall, when cold sweetness touched their tongues and tears touched their cheek. For a moment, war receded and humanity surfaced. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. Not that America was flawless, nor that captivity was easy, but that even in the darkest chapters of history, small mercies can illuminate the path. A spoonful of ice cream, served without malice, became more than food. It became a mirror reflecting two worlds, the world of scarcity and fear they had left, and the world of abundance and contradiction they had entered. In the end, the story is not about dessert at all. It is about the shattering of illusions, the collision of ideology with reality, the slow awakening of prisoners to a truth larger than themselves. And it is about the tears of women who, in tasting sweetness, realized both what they had lost and what might still be possible. Because if chocolate ice cream could exist in captivity, then perhaps, just perhaps, life after war could hold sweetness too.